I worked myself to the bone to save $50,000 for my mother's life-saving surgery. My stepbrother, Evan, stole every cent of it to fund a luxury Christmas vacation in Miami. When the police told me he was about to board his flight, I didn't cry. I looked the officer in the eye and said, "That plane is not taking off." What happened at the airport wasn't just an arrest. It was a Christmas miracle of justice that you will never forget. Before I continue, if you believe that karma always collects its debt, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. My story started in hell. My name is Quinn. I'm 24 years old, and I don't even remember the last time I slept through the night. By day, I was buried under the pressure of my master's degree at the University of Rochester. By night, I stood at a Walmart register until my feet went numb. Exhaustion wasn't just a feeling, it was my only companion. Why did I punish myself like this? For my mother, Margaret. Her heart was failing, and the upcoming surgery, the one the insurance company labeled out of network, was her only chance at survival. My goal was $50,000. That wasn't just money to me. That was my mother's breath. It was her smile. It was a few more years of life. Every single tip, every spare dime went into a locked metal box under my bed. I starved myself. I sacrificed my youth, and finally, I had done it. The box was full. Living under the same roof was my stepbrother, Evan. He was my exact opposite. 21, jobless, and only interested in partying with his irresponsible friends. My sacrifices meant nothing to him, but I never imagined he could be this cruel, that he could turn into a monster. That day was the darkest of my life. I had just walked in from a final exam, my brain completely fried. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of my mother's breathing machine, but something felt wrong. I ran straight to my room. I knelt down by the bed, and my world collapsed. The metal box was there, but the lid had been pried open. The lock was broken, and inside, it was empty. My months of labor, my sweat, my mother's life, all gone. I panicked and ran to Evan's room. His closet was empty. His suitcase was gone. On his messy desk lay a crumpled piece of paper, a brochure for a 5-star hotel in Miami Beach. My legs gave out, and I collapsed right there on the floor. This wasn't just theft. This was attempted murder. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold my phone when I called Tyler, Evan's closest friend and the only person who might know where he went. Tyler picked up after 3 rings, his voice groggy and confused. "Quinn, what's up?" he mumbled, clearly half asleep. I didn't have time for pleasantries, so I cut straight to the point and demanded to know where Evan was. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Tyler's brain working, trying to decide whether to protect his friend or tell me the truth. Finally, he sighed deeply and admitted that Evan had been bragging for weeks about spending Christmas in Miami, telling everyone that he was going to live it up in style and that he would cover all the costs for his buddies who wanted to join him. Tyler said Evan had been flashing cash around, buying drinks at bars, and acting like he had just won the lottery. When I asked him point blank if Evan had mentioned where he got the money, Tyler went quiet again before saying in a small, guilty voice that he had assumed Evan's dad had given it to him, or that maybe Evan had finally gotten a job. But deep down, Tyler admitted, he knew something didn't add up because Evan had never worked a day in his life, and his father had cut him off months ago after one too many disappointments. My blood turned to ice in my veins as Tyler continued talking, telling me that Evan's flight was scheduled to leave from Rochester International Airport that very evening at 8 p.m., and that he and 3 other friends were supposed to meet him at the gate for what Evan kept calling the best Christmas of our lives. I thanked Tyler and hung up immediately, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios, each one worse than the last. I looked at the clock on my nightstand and saw that it was already 5:30 in the afternoon, which meant I had less than 2.5 hours to stop Evan before he disappeared into the Florida sunshine with my mother's life savings. I called the police station with trembling fingers and was connected to Officer Davidson, a middle-aged woman with a firm but compassionate voice who listened carefully as I explained the entire situation in one breathless rush of words. I told her about my mother's surgery, about the months I had spent saving every penny, about the locked box under my bed, and about Evan's sudden disappearance along with all my money. Officer Davidson asked me several detailed questions about Evan's full name, his date of birth, his physical description, and whether I had any proof that the money was mine. I explained that I had kept meticulous records of every deposit, every shift I worked, and every dollar I earned, all documented in a notebook that I kept beside the metal box. Within 20 minutes, Officer Davidson and her partner, Officer Martinez, arrived at my house in a patrol car with flashing lights that lit up the entire street. My mother woke up from her nap, confused and frightened by all the commotion, and I had to gently explain to her what Evan had done while trying to keep my own voice steady so she wouldn't panic and worsen her already fragile condition. The look of betrayal and heartbreak on her face was almost worse than discovering the empty box, because she had always defended Evan, always made excuses for his behavior, always believed that deep down he was a good kid who just needed time to mature. Now she realized that her blind faith had enabled a thief. Officer Davidson examined the broken lock on the metal box and took photographs of the pry marks, noting that the damage was recent and clearly done with some kind of tool, probably a screwdriver or a crowbar. She also took pictures of the empty box, the Miami Beach hotel brochure in Evan's room, and the meticulous financial records I had kept in my notebook. Officer Martinez made several phone calls to the airport security team, the TSA supervisor on duty, and the airline that Evan was supposedly flying with, requesting that they detain a passenger matching Evan's description if he attempted to check in or board the flight. The officers assured me that they were taking this case very seriously, and that they would do everything in their power to stop Evan before he could escape with my money. But as we drove toward the airport in the back of the police cruiser, with Officer Davidson at the wheel and Officer Martinez typing rapidly on his laptop to pull up Evan's records, I felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach because I knew how slippery and manipulative Evan could be when he wanted something. He had talked his way out of trouble his entire life, charming teachers who caught him cheating, sweet-talking employers who fired him for not showing up, and convincing my mother to forgive him every single time he messed up. What if he managed to charm his way past airport security? What if he convinced them that this was all a misunderstanding? What if he was already sitting on that plane, sipping a complimentary beverage and laughing about how he had fooled everyone? Officer Martinez must have sensed my anxiety because he turned around in his seat and told me in a calm, reassuring voice that the airport had already flagged Evan's name in their system and that there was no way he would be allowed to board any flight until this situation was resolved. He explained that when someone is flagged for a serious theft investigation, the TSA takes it very seriously and coordinates with local law enforcement to ensure that the suspect doesn't flee the jurisdiction. I nodded and tried to take comfort in his words, but my heart was still pounding so hard that I could hear it echoing in my ears. We arrived at Rochester International Airport at 7:15 p.m., which gave us 45 minutes before Evan's scheduled departure time. The airport was decorated with twinkling Christmas lights, enormous wreaths, and a massive tree in the center of the terminal, all of which felt like a cruel mockery of the holiday spirit, because while everyone around me was excited about their vacation plans and family reunions, I was racing against time to stop my own stepbrother from destroying my mother's last chance at survival. Officer Davidson led us straight to the airport security office, where we were greeted by TSA supervisor Linda Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had already reviewed the case details that Officer Martinez had sent over. Supervisor Chen pulled up the passenger manifest on her computer and confirmed that Evan Parker had checked in online earlier that day and had already printed his boarding pass, which meant he was planning to breeze through security with just a carry-on bag to avoid any delays at baggage claim. She also informed us that 3 other passengers with the same last known address had checked in for the same flight, which confirmed Tyler's story about Evan bringing his friends along for the trip. Supervisor Chen immediately contacted the security checkpoint and instructed her team to watch for Evan and his companions, providing them with photographs that Officer Martinez had pulled from Evan's social media accounts. We didn't have to wait long because at 7:30 p.m., Supervisor Chen's radio crackled to life, and one of the TSA agents reported that a male passenger matching Evan's description had just entered the security line at Checkpoint B and was currently placing his belongings into the screening bins. My heart leapt into my throat and I jumped to my feet, ready to run to the checkpoint myself. But Officer Davidson gently placed a hand on my shoulder and told me to wait because they needed to handle this properly to ensure that Evan didn't cause a scene or try to run. Supervisor Chen, Officer Davidson, and Officer Martinez walked briskly toward Checkpoint B while I followed a few steps behind, my entire body trembling with a mixture of rage, relief, and disbelief. When we reached Checkpoint B, I saw him standing there in the security line with his ridiculous oversized sunglasses perched on top of his head and a brand new designer backpack slung over his shoulder, looking completely relaxed and carefree like he was just another tourist heading off on a well-deserved vacation. Next to him stood 3 of his usual crew, all of them laughing and joking around, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to crash down on their heads. Evan was showing them something on his phone, probably pictures of the Miami hotel or the beach club they were planning to hit up, and they were all grinning like idiots who had just won the lottery. The sight of him standing there so casually, so arrogantly after what he had done to me and to our mother made my blood boil to a temperature I didn't even know was possible. Officer Davidson approached the TSA agent manning the checkpoint and showed her badge, speaking in low tones that I couldn't quite hear over the general noise of the airport. The TSA agent nodded seriously and pressed a button that caused a red light to flash at Evan's screening station, which signaled to the other agents that this passenger required special attention. Evan noticed the light and glanced around with a confused expression, but he still didn't seem worried because he probably assumed it was just a random security check that happened to travelers all the time. He stepped forward when instructed and walked through the metal detector, which beeped loudly and caused the TSA agents to pull him aside for a secondary screening. That's when Officer Martinez stepped into view and called out Evan's full name in a voice that carried across the entire security area, causing dozens of travelers to stop what they were doing and turn to look at the commotion. Evan's face went from confused to shocked to absolutely pale in the span of about 3 seconds as he realized that he was looking at 2 police officers and a TSA supervisor who were all staring directly at him with expressions that left no room for misunderstanding. His 3 friends immediately took several steps backward, trying to distance themselves from whatever trouble Evan had gotten himself into. And I noticed that one of them actually pulled out his phone and started recording the whole scene because apparently even in moments of crisis, social media is more important than loyalty. Officer Davidson stepped forward and informed Evan in a clear, authoritative voice that he was being detained for questioning regarding the theft of $50,000 from his sister's residence and that he needed to come with them immediately for further investigation. Evan's mouth dropped open and he started sputtering protests, claiming that this was all a huge misunderstanding and that the money was a gift from his father and that he had every right to use it however he wanted. Officer Martinez calmly informed him that those claims would be investigated, but in the meantime, he needed to cooperate fully, or additional charges would be added for obstruction of justice and resisting detention. Evan looked around desperately, perhaps hoping that someone would come to his rescue or that this was all some kind of elaborate prank. But when he made eye contact with me, standing about 20 feet away with tears streaming down my face, an absolute fury radiating from every pore of my body, he knew that the game was over. His shoulders slumped and all the cockiness drained out of him like air from a punctured balloon as he realized that he wasn't going to talk his way out of this one. The TSA agents retrieved his designer backpack and his phone from the screening bins and handed them over to Officer Martinez, who would hold them as evidence until the investigation was complete. As the officers led Evan away from the checkpoint toward a secure interview room, his 3 friends were also stopped and questioned by additional TSA agents who wanted to know if they had any knowledge of the stolen money, or if they were willing to cooperate with the investigation. I watched with grim satisfaction as their exciting Miami vacation evaporated right before their eyes. replaced by the harsh reality that they had been partying with stolen money and might now be considered accessories to the crime. One of them, a skinny guy named Derek, who I recognized from Evan's Instagram posts, started crying and insisting that he had no idea where Evan got the money and that he just thought they were going on a regular trip that Evan's family had paid for. Supervisor Chen escorted me to a private office where I could sit down and give my full statement without the chaos of the busy airport around us. She brought me a bottle of water and a box of tissues, and for the first time since discovering the empty metal box, I allowed myself to completely break down and sob with the kind of raw emotion that comes from months of exhaustion, stress, and betrayal all hitting you at once. Supervisor Chen sat quietly beside me and didn't try to rush me or tell me to calm down. She just let me cry until I had no tears left and my breathing started to return to something resembling normal. Once I had composed myself enough to speak clearly, I gave Supervisor Chen and the officers every single detail about the timeline of events, about my work schedule and how I had saved the money, about the locked metal box and the broken lock, about Tyler's phone call confirming Evan's plans, and about the hotel brochure I had found in his room. Officer Martinez took detailed notes and assured me that they would be reviewing airport surveillance footage to track Evan's movements and purchases throughout the terminal, which would provide additional evidence of his intent to flee the jurisdiction with stolen funds. He also mentioned that they would be contacting the credit card companies and the airline to determine if Evan had used my financial information to purchase the tickets, which would add identity theft and fraud charges to the growing list of crimes he had committed. In the interview room down the hall, Evan was apparently spinning a completely different story, claiming that his father had wired him the money as an early Christmas gift and that he had no idea Quinn was saving money for their mother's surgery because nobody had ever told him about it. But his story fell apart almost immediately when Officer Davidson asked him to provide proof of the wire transfer or any bank records showing a deposit of $50,000 into his account. Evan stammered and backtracked, saying that actually his father had given him cash and that he didn't have any receipts because it was a family matter, and they didn't document everything like businesses do. Officer Davidson then asked him why his father would give him exactly $50,000 in cash, right when his sister's carefully saved $50,000 went missing from a locked box in the same house, and Evan had no answer except to mutter something about coincidence. The officers also discovered something very interesting when they examined Evan's designer backpack, because tucked into one of the inner pockets was a thick envelope containing approximately $12,000 in cash, all in crisp $100 bills that looked like they had come straight from a bank withdrawal. When asked why he was carrying that much cash to Miami when he supposedly had plenty of money for the trip, Evan claimed that he liked to have spending money for restaurants and clubs, but the officers knew better. They suspected that Evan had already started spending my savings on pre-trip purchases like his new backpack, new clothes, and bar tabs for his friends, and that the $12,000 in cash was what remained of the money he hadn't yet blown through. Officer Martinez came to the private office to update me on the situation and told me that based on the evidence they had gathered so far, including the broken lock, the timing of Evan's disappearance, the cash found in his possession, and his inability to provide any legitimate proof of where the money came from, they had more than enough probable cause to arrest him for grand larceny. He explained that in New York State, theft of property valued over $50,000 is classified as grand larceny in the second degree, which is a Class C felony that carries a potential prison sentence of up to 15 years. Hearing those words should have made me feel victorious, but instead I just felt hollow and sad, because this was my stepbrother we were talking about, someone I had grown up with, someone who I had once believed might eventually grow up and become a responsible adult. But then Officer Martinez told me something that made my heart swell with a feeling I hadn't experienced in months, something that reminded me that sometimes the universe does reward people who work hard and do the right thing. He said that after reviewing the case with the district attorney's office, they had agreed to prioritize the return of the stolen funds to me as quickly as possible rather than holding everything as evidence for months while the case worked its way through the court system. The $12,000 in cash that they had recovered from Evan's backpack would be returned to me within 72 hours after being logged and photographed as evidence, and they would work with the airline and the hotel to reverse the charges that Evan had made using my information and credit cards. But there was still a significant problem because Evan had already spent a substantial portion of the $50,000 on various purchases over the past week, including the plane tickets for himself and his 3 friends, which cost about $6,000 total. The 5-star hotel reservation, which had required a deposit of $8,000, new clothes and accessories, which probably added up to another $3,000 or $4,000, and countless bar tabs and restaurant bills that were almost impossible to track down. Even with the $12,000 in recovered cash and the reversed charges, I was still going to be short by at least $15,000 to $20,000, which meant my mother's surgery fund was still devastated and we were back to square one. I sat in that airport office feeling like I had climbed a mountain only to discover there was another mountain twice as tall waiting on the other side. And for a moment, I genuinely considered just giving up on everything because the universe seemed determined to punish me, no matter how hard I tried to do the right thing. Officer Martinez must have seen the defeat written all over my face because he leaned forward and told me something that changed everything. He said that in cases like this where the victim has suffered significant financial harm and the perpetrator is clearly guilty, there are often victim assistance programs and restitution orders that can help recover the lost funds, and that I should document absolutely everything because the court would likely order Evan to repay every single penny he stole, with interest and penalties added on top. Supervisor Chen, who had been listening quietly to our conversation, suddenly spoke up and said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me that she had been following the story as it unfolded and that she was deeply moved by my dedication to my mother and the sacrifices I had made, and that she wanted to do something to help beyond just her official duties. She pulled out her personal phone and opened up a social media app, showing me a post that someone had written about the situation because apparently the guy who had been filming Evan's detention at the security checkpoint had posted the video online with a caption explaining that a young woman's stepbrother had stolen her mother's surgery money for a vacation and had been arrested at the airport. The video had already been viewed over 200,000 times in the hour since it was posted, and the comment section was absolutely flooded with people expressing outrage at Evan's actions and sympathy for my situation. Dozens of people were asking if there was a way to donate money to help cover the surgery costs, and several had already tagged local news stations and advocacy groups to bring attention to the case. Supervisor Chen suggested that with my permission, she could help me set up a legitimate fundraising campaign through a verified platform where people who wanted to help could contribute directly to my mother's medical expenses, and that given the viral nature of the video and the compelling story behind it, there was a very real possibility that we could raise the remaining money needed for the surgery. I was stunned into silence because this was so far beyond anything I could have imagined or hoped for just a few hours earlier when I was kneeling beside that empty metal box, feeling like my entire world had ended. Officer Davidson nodded enthusiastically and added that she had seen similar cases where community support had made an enormous difference, and that she would be happy to provide a statement verifying the facts of the case for any news outlets or fundraising platforms that requested official confirmation. She also mentioned that the Rochester Police Department had a public information officer who could help coordinate media requests if the story continued to gain traction, which would ensure that the fundraising campaign was seen as legitimate and trustworthy rather than potentially being mistaken for a scam. Over the next several hours, while Evan was being formally arrested and processed at the airport police substation, I worked with Supervisor Chen to set up a verified fundraising campaign on a major crowdfunding platform that specialized in medical expenses. We wrote a detailed description of my mother's condition, the urgent need for surgery, the months I had spent saving money, and the devastating theft that had nearly destroyed everything. We included copies of the police report, photographs of the broken lock and empty box, and even a statement from my mother's cardiologist confirming that the surgery was medically necessary and time-sensitive. Supervisor Chen used her position and credentials to verify the campaign as legitimate, which would help prevent skeptical donors from thinking this was some kind of internet scam. By the time we finished setting everything up and posted the campaign link on social media, it was nearly midnight and I was so exhausted that I could barely keep my eyes open, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the airport because I needed to know exactly what was going to happen to Evan and when I would be able to recover the rest of my money. Officer Martinez told me that Evan had been formally charged with grand larceny in the second degree and criminal possession of stolen property, and that he was being transported to the Monroe County Jail where he would be held until his arraignment hearing the following morning. His 3 friends had been questioned extensively but were ultimately released without charges because they had genuinely believed that Evan's money was legitimate, and they had no knowledge of the theft, although their Miami vacation was obviously canceled, and they would likely be called as witnesses in the criminal trial. I finally went home around 1 in the morning, completely drained physically and emotionally, and found my mother still awake in her bed with her oxygen machine humming beside her. She had been watching the news on her tablet and had seen some of the social media coverage of Evan's arrest, and when I walked into her room, she started crying and apologizing over and over again for not seeing what kind of person Evan had become, and for defending him all those times when I had tried to warn her about his behavior. I sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand and told her that none of this was her fault, because she had only ever tried to see the best in people, which is a beautiful quality even when it gets taken advantage of by those who don't deserve it. Then, I showed her the fundraising campaign that Supervisor Chen had helped me create, and we watched together in real time as the donation counter started climbing with contributions from complete strangers who had been touched by our story and wanted to help. $10 here, $25 there, occasionally $100 or more from someone who had dealt with similar medical expenses in their own family and knew exactly how devastating the costs could be. My mother kept squeezing my hand tighter and tighter as the total climbed past $1,000, then $2,000, then $5,000, and she whispered that she couldn't believe so many people cared about 2 people they had never even met. I barely slept that night because I kept checking my phone every few minutes to see the updated donation total, and every time I refreshed the page, there were dozens of new contributions and hundreds of new comments from people all over the country sharing their own stories about medical debt and family betrayal and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. By sunrise, the campaign had raised over $18,000, which when combined with the $12,000 in recovered cash and the reversed charges from the airline and hotel, meant that we were actually going to have enough money for my mother's surgery, with maybe even a little bit left over to cover some of the post-operative care expenses. The local news stations picked up the story that morning, and several reporters came to our house asking for interviews, wanting to know more about the young woman who had worked 2 jobs to save her mother's life, only to have her own stepbrother steal everything. I agreed to do one on-camera interview with a reporter from the local ABC affiliate because I felt like it was important to publicly acknowledge all the people who had donated and to show that their kindness had made a real difference in our lives. During the interview, I made sure to thank Officer Davidson, Officer Martinez, and Supervisor Chen by name, because without their quick action and genuine compassion, Evan would have escaped to Miami, and I might never have recovered any of the money. That same morning, Evan appeared in court for his arraignment hearing where the judge reviewed the charges against him and listened to the prosecutor's summary of the evidence. Evan's court-appointed attorney tried to argue that this was a family dispute that should be resolved privately rather than through the criminal justice system, but the prosecutor immediately shot that argument down by pointing out that this wasn't a disagreement over who gets to use the car or who does the dishes. This was the deliberate theft of $50,000 that was intended to pay for a life-saving medical procedure. The judge agreed with the prosecutor and set Evan's bail at $75,000, which his father absolutely refused to pay because he was finally done enabling his son's destructive behavior. So Evan remained in jail while his case worked its way through the legal system, and I received regular updates from the prosecutor's office about the progress of the investigation and the likely outcome of the trial. The evidence against Evan was so overwhelming that his attorney eventually recommended that he accept a plea deal rather than going to trial and risking a much harsher sentence. The plea deal included a guilty plea to grand larceny in the second degree, a sentence of 3 to 5 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, and a court-ordered restitution payment of the full $50,000 plus an additional $10,000 to cover my legal expenses, emotional distress, and the time I had lost from work and school dealing with this nightmare. The fundraising campaign continued to grow beyond anything I could have possibly imagined, reaching a total of $47,000 within the first week as news of the story spread across social media platforms and even got picked up by several national news outlets who were covering it as a heartwarming example of community support, overcoming family betrayal during the holiday season. People from all 50 states and even several foreign countries had contributed whatever they could afford, along with thousands of comments expressing their support and sharing their own stories about medical debt, difficult family situations, and the power of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. With the recovered cash, the reversed charges, the fundraising donations, and the court-ordered restitution that would eventually come from Evan, my mother's surgery fund was not only restored, but actually exceeded the original goal by a significant margin, which meant we could afford the absolute best surgical team and the highest quality post-operative care without having to worry about cutting corners or accepting second-best options. My mother's cardiologist was able to schedule the surgery for early January, just a few weeks away, and he assured us that with proper care and rehabilitation, she had an excellent chance of making a full recovery and living a normal, active life for many years to come. The surgery took place on a cold Tuesday morning in the first week of January, and I sat in the hospital waiting room for 7 hours while a team of skilled surgeons repaired the damage to my mother's heart and gave her the second chance at life that she so desperately needed and absolutely deserved. Officer Davidson stopped by the hospital during her lunch break to check on us and bring me a coffee and a sandwich, and Supervisor Chen sent a beautiful flower arrangement with a card that said simply, "You never gave up, and that made all the difference." When the lead surgeon finally emerged from the operating room still wearing his scrubs and pulled down his surgical mask to reveal a tired but satisfied smile, I knew before he even spoke that everything had gone well. He told me that the surgery was a complete success, that my mother's heart was now functioning properly, and that with proper medication and lifestyle adjustments, she should be able to live a long and healthy life without any significant limitations. My mother spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from the surgery, and I visited her every single day after my classes and brought her favorite foods that the doctors had cleared for her new diet. She told me repeatedly that she was so proud of me for handling everything with such strength and maturity, and I assured her that she had nothing to apologize for because her only crime was loving her stepson and hoping he would eventually become a better person. Evan eventually accepted the plea deal because his attorney made it crystal clear that if he went to trial with the mountain of evidence against him, he would almost certainly be convicted and receive the maximum sentence of 15 years, rather than the 3 to 5 years being offered in the plea agreement. During his sentencing hearing, the judge gave him an opportunity to make a statement, and I genuinely hoped that he would use that moment to show some remorse and acknowledge the pain he had caused. But instead, he mumbled something about making a mistake and not really understanding the consequences of his actions. The judge was evidently unimpressed because she added an extra year to his sentence, making it 4 to 6 years instead of 3 to 5. And she specifically stated that his complete lack of genuine remorse demonstrated that he needed more time to reflect on the gravity of what he had done. The months following the surgery and Evan's sentencing were a period of healing and rebuilding for both my mother and myself, as we slowly adjusted to our new reality where we no longer had to live in constant fear of medical bills we couldn't pay. My mother's recovery progressed better than anyone expected, and within a few months she was strong enough to go for long walks in the park, help with light housework, and even talk about the possibility of returning to part-time work once she felt completely ready. The fundraising campaign had raised so much more than we needed for the surgery that I was able to use the excess funds to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a small but comfortable apartment where my mother and I could start fresh in a space that didn't hold any painful memories of Evan's betrayal. I also made a point of staying in touch with Officer Davidson, Officer Martinez, and Supervisor Chen because they had become more than just the professionals who helped me during a crisis. They had become genuine friends. Officer Davidson invited me to speak at a community event about resilience and the importance of asking for help when you need it, and Supervisor Chen recommended me for a part-time position working with victim advocacy programs at the airport, helping other people who found themselves in crisis situations while traveling. The most surprising development came almost a year after the initial incident, when I received a letter from Evan that had been forwarded through his prison counselor. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope to find 3 pages of handwritten text where he finally took full responsibility for what he had done, acknowledging that he had been selfish, cruel, and completely blind to the pain he was causing. He wrote about the therapy sessions he had been attending in prison where he was learning about impulse control and empathy, and he said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again because he knew that some betrayals are simply too deep to forgive. He also promised that once he was released, he would work whatever jobs were necessary to pay back every single dollar of the restitution he owed, not because the court ordered him to, but because it was the right thing to do. I read that letter 3 times before I finally folded it up and put it back in the envelope. And I honestly didn't know what to think or feel, because part of me wanted to believe that people can change and that Evan was genuinely on a path toward becoming a better person. But another part of me remembered how many times he had said the right things in the past, only to go right back to his old patterns. I decided not to respond to the letter immediately, because I needed time to process my own feelings, but I also didn't throw the letter away, because I wanted to hold on to it as a reminder that sometimes growth happens in unexpected places, and that redemption is possible for those who are truly willing to do the work. As I sit here now, nearly 2 years after that terrible December day when I discovered the empty metal box under my bed, I can honestly say that my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My mother is healthy and thriving. I graduated with my master's degree and landed a great job in my field. We live in a beautiful apartment that feels like home. And I've learned that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but rather a recognition that we all need support sometimes, and that there are more good people in the world than bad ones. The story of what happened to us became something of a local legend in Rochester, and occasionally I still meet people who recognize me from the news coverage, or who contributed to the fundraising campaign and want to know how we're doing now. Every single time, I make sure to tell them that their kindness saved more than just my mother's life. It saved my faith in humanity and proved that even in our darkest moments when everything seems hopeless and unfair, there are still people who will step up and help a stranger simply because it's the right thing to do. And that Christmas miracle of justice that happened in the airport? It wasn't just about Evan getting arrested or the money being recovered or even about the surgery being successful, though all of those things were undeniably important. The real miracle was discovering that when you refuse to give up and when you stand up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, the universe has a way of conspiring to help you succeed, often through the kindness and compassion of people you've never met who see your struggle and decide that they want to be part of your solution. My mother is sitting in the next room right now, working on a quilt she's making for a charity auction to raise money for other families facing medical debt, and I can hear her humming along to Christmas carols on the radio. After everything we've been through, every day feels like a reason to celebrate because we made it through the darkness and came out the other side stronger, wiser, and more grateful than we ever thought possible. That plane didn't take off that night, and Evan didn't get his luxury vacation. But what I gained was so much more valuable than what he tried to steal from me. I gained proof that determination and integrity matter, that community support can move mountains, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best versions of ourselves. And that, my friends, is the real Christmas miracle.